Are we? Oh, hello. Mic test. Test mic. Hello. Hello, mic test. Can we all please settle down so we can start with our last session? Right. All right. I think we can start our last session. Can we invite the last participants to please come in? All right. Good afternoon and welcome to the last session for today's proceedings. We have another set of distinguished speakers for this afternoon, and hopefully we learn more again from the three speakers that we have. I would like to invite the speakers to please stay in front, and I will introduce them one by one. The first speaker that we have is Professor Dr. Sam Perdue, the Dean of the UGA College of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences, and he will be talking about food safety concerns in poultry and poultry exports. So let's put our hands together for him. And we invite you to sit down first, and we will call you one by one. All right. Okay, our next in line, we have Professor Dr. Amrit Bart. He is the Assistant Dean and Director of the Office of Global Programs of UGA, and he will be discussing about food safety and seafood. Let's warmly welcome Dr. Bart. And lastly, we have Professor Dr. John Bernard of the UGA College of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences, who will be discussing about food safety concerns in milk and dairy products. Thank you. And just like earlier this afternoon, we will have a moderator for the question and answer. I would like to call on Assistant Professor Praikaijan Nimkimura of the KKU Faculty of Agriculture to join our distinguished speakers in front. Let's give him a warm round of applause. So I will give you a brief backgrounder of our distinguished speakers for this afternoon. First, as I've mentioned, Dr. Sam is the current Dean and Director of the College of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences in the University of Georgia in the United States. His major accomplishments include almost 100 journal articles and book chapters, and leading the NCSU Poultry Science Department to a top 10 ranking in 5 research publications and citation criteria among departments of animal and poultry sciences, plus the honor award of an outstanding teacher. The next speaker that we have for this afternoon is Professor Dr. Amrit Bart. Currently, he's working as an Assistant Dean and Director for Office of Global Programs and Professor of Animal and Dairy Science in UGA. Dr. Bart is also an internationally recognized scientist in the field of aquaculture and aquatic sciences. And I heard that he also was in AIT, which is also my alma mater in Bangkok. And so it's glad to see someone from the same university. And lastly, we have our Professor Dr. John Bernard. He is a professor from the College of Agricultural and Environmental Sciences in the UGA also. His research interests include improving utilization of nutrients provided by forages and byproducts, feeds and dairy rations, and the improving of dairy producer returns through the use of good management practices, GMP, and decision making. So once again, let's give a warm round of applause to our distinguished set of speakers this afternoon.
I think the first talk will be presented by Professor Sam Perdue. So everyone could welcome him. Oh, you can be there or can be here. It's okay.
Well, good afternoon. It's always hard after a break. It's been a long day, so thank you all for your presence here. I want to focus on poultry and egg products and some of the challenges that we have in the poultry industry. And you never knew that pathogens could be so pretty and colorful, but they create some major challenges. So in the U.S., there are 3 government agencies that have responsibilities for ensuring food safety. The CDC, which is based in Atlanta, Georgia, about 60 miles from our campus, monitors infectious disease outbreaks. FDA, or the Food and Drug Administration, has oversight on regulatory issues surrounding pharmaceuticals, tobacco use, for example, vaccines. And finally, USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture. And USDA is involved, obviously, in farming, agriculture, and forestry, but also has a group within it called FSIS, or the Food Safety Inspection Service. So it is distributed across 3 agencies that have slightly different responsibilities, but in theory work together, although in practice not always, to ensure a safe food supply. So first I wanted to talk a little bit about why poultry consumption has increased, particularly in the U.S. and in some cases globally as well. In the U.S., with all due respect to my colleague who's on the beef side, in the 1970s and 80s there was some negative publicity, or at least published reports about eating red meat. And we now know that some of those reports were not accurate. But there was a time where a lot of consumers in the U.S., we saw a drop in red meat consumption. One of the other factors that influences poultry consumption is the relative cost of products. And in the U.S., poultry is one of the lowest cost protein sources that you can purchase. And the other concern by some consumers is the carbon footprint made by other animal protein sources. If you look at feed conversion rates, for example, aquaculture is among the best, poultry, followed by pork, and then cattle. Of course, my colleagues on the animal science side will point out that many times those cattle are being raised on pasture lands and they're consuming grasses, and the impact there is far, far less. So what has happened in the U.S. in the past 3 years is that there's been a 12% increase in poultry that are listed on U.S. restaurant menus. So the product is certainly expanded in the recent years. In fact, if you look at this table, and I realize that it's spanning a period of time from the mid-60s projecting out to 2030, and one of the things that you'll see is global poultry meat is projected to increase over 400% from the mid-60s to 2030. And if you look in the developing world, it's even higher. Back in the mid-60s, about 1.2 kilos per person globally, and those are projected in areas in the developing world, excluding China and Brazil, to be 14 kilograms. And so some phenomenal increases. Other sources have been somewhat flat. If you look at, for example, globally, bovine about 10 kilograms, 2030 about 10.6, so a slight increase there. Sheep and goats, not a great deal of change. Some increase as well in swine. So globally, poultry has expanded tremendously over the past 50 years. In fact, if you look at changes in poultry consumption specific to different regions of the world, you'll see on the map, the darker green indicate areas where increases have occurred to the greatest degree. And then if you look at per capita consumption, and there is an error on that slide, that should be 2014 kilograms per capita in Thailand, Vietnam, China, the Ukraine, and the U.S. And you'll see the changes that will occur within a 10-year period. Certainly they have expanded tremendously. Now, least in the U.S., but there again, by 2024, the average American consumer will eat somewhere around almost 45 kilos of chicken. Tremendous volume. But the rest of the world is certainly expanding at a much faster rate than we are here in the U.S. You can see Thailand over almost 22% increase, Vietnam almost a 37% increase. So while we've seen a great increase in poultry consumption, any future consumption is going to be dependent upon the fact that we have a safe and reliable food source. So if expansion of any meat product, for example, is going to occur, it's because we provided a safe product. Some of you may be familiar with an issue that occurred in a number of countries. In the EU, over 15 countries had issues. South Korea, Switzerland, Taiwan, Hong Kong, with a pesticide called fipronil. Fipronil somehow made its way into the food chain of laying hens, and the eggs were contaminated. And there are a number of articles that talked about issues in Germany, the millions of eggs that had to be destroyed because of contamination from an insecticide. Food safety, quite frankly, is a political issue. It is used as a non-tariff trade barrier in some instances. One of the things that is occurring now is with the new government in the U.S., they're reevaluating trade policies and trade agreements, one of being NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And the question that will occur in the future is that treaty may be renegotiated, is what's the role of food safety going to be in that particular agreement. And one of the things that hopefully will come out of that is an ability for multiple nations to work together in assessing and preventing emerging foodborne illnesses. Sharing information. I talked about the fact that USDA, FDA, and the CDC, in theory, will share information. Well, it's certainly hopeful that we'll continue to build international networks to do that as well. Traceability is going to continue to be an issue as we go forward. Whether it's in poultry or in fruits and produce, being able to trace that product back to where it was produced, how it was processed, is going to be essential. So, major issues when you think about salmonellosis, frequently people just immediately assume, oh, I contracted this from poultry. It's not always the case. These are data from 1998 to 2012 that produced by the CDC on salmonella cases in the U.S. About 22% were identified from eggs, seeded vegetables, chicken, and then you can see other fruits and other products. So in many ways, it's not just poultry, it's the source of salmonellosis in the U.S., but from multiple sources. Issues surrounding E. coli 0157, these are Shiga toxin producing E. coli, and you can see beef, somewhat surprising, row and vegetable crops, fruits, dairy, and bean sprouts being, again, a major issue for E. coli infections in the U.S. Looking at the same time period, that 1998 to 2012, for domestically acquired foodborne illnesses in the U.S., if you look at all agents, whether they are bacterial, chemical, parasital, or viral, you'll see that land animals represent about 42% of all the food-related illnesses or contaminated sources. But it varies greatly. Land animals, for example, almost 2/3 of all the bacterial infections were associated with land animals. And only about 13% of the chemical residues were detected, and hardly any parasites, and about 30% of those viral diseases. If you look at plant products, for example, it's a little bit different profile. Certainly bacterial, a lot more chemicals if you look at herbicides and pesticide residues that exceed limits. But if you look at aquatic animals, they are far and away the ones that have the greatest frequency of chemical contaminants. And so depending on whether you're talking about aquatic animals, land animals, or fruits and vegetables, the incidence of foodborne illness or contamination varies greatly. If you break the land animals down among commodity groups, dairy, eggs, beef, wild game, pork, and poultry, again, you'll see the distribution is different based upon what particular product that you are consuming. And again, for poultry, significant amount of bacterial-related foodborne illness relative to others. Dairy is also just slightly higher. And again, for poultry, if you look at land meat animals, poultry has about 8% of the chemical contaminated frequency of illnesses, much higher than any other source in that case. So there are some challenges in the poultry industry, and some great strides have been made, but there's much left to be done. So foodborne illness in the United States is a major issue. Every year, roughly 48 million Americans, that's roughly 1 out of 6, have a foodborne illness. Of those 48 million, 128,000 on average require hospitalization, and tragically 3,000 people die every year from foodborne illness in the U.S. The challenge is, of those 48 million who have that, they only can determine the causative pathogen in about 9 million of those cases. And of those, 55,000 are hospitalized and about 1,000 die. So we, in many cases, are dealing with less than ideal information. So I'd like to describe foodborne illness as really the tip of the iceberg. We only see part of what really occurs. And the reason being is that this is the percent that did not visit a physician. Campylobacter, E. coli, Listeria, norovirus, and Salmonella. So almost 94% of people who had a Campylobacter infection never went to the doctor. Now, I have personally had a Campylobacter infection. It took 2 bags of saline for me to get rehydrated. I would have gone to the doctor. Look at Listeria, however, very different. Only 8.5% of people who had an identified Listeria infection did not go to the doctor. And there's a reason why, and I'll show that in just a minute. So great variation depending on what's the source of the infection. So these are some costs of foodborne illness in the U.S., and I will say that they are probably underestimated significantly. There have been estimates as high of in excess of $100 billion a year. These are just for individual organisms. And you can see Campylobacter, almost $2 billion. Listeria, almost $3 billion. And then Salmonella, $3.6 billion. And again, these are in all likelihood very underestimated. Here's the difference. Percent of individuals who have a foodborne illness episode that were hospitalized. And it's relatively low except for one, and that's Listeria. If you contracted a Listeria infection, the odds are you're going to end up in the hospital. And the reason being is the mortality rate associated with Listeria is so much higher. You will really feel bad if you have a Campylobacter infection. I can tell you that. Or if you have Salmonella. But it is not likely that you're going to die. However, look at the differential between that and Listeria. So very quickly, I'll give you a historical perspective on poultry food safety and the governmental legislation that attempted to improve processing. Back in 1957, really one of the first major events was the Poultry Processing Inspection Act, followed in 1968 by the Wholesome Poultry Products Inspection Act, and then something in 1996, which was a real game changer, referred to as the mega regs, and it brought about HACCP, the Hazardous Analysis and Critical Control Points legislation. And of course, the most recent one is in 2011, where new standards for Campylobacter infections and Salmonella in young chicken were brought into law. So for the U.S., inspection and regulation falls within two areas, primarily through USDA's food inspection service. All chickens are mandatorily inspected. Each carcass has to be viewed. There is now zero tolerance for any fecal matter on the carcass after evisceration. And all carcasses have to be chilled to 4 degrees C within 4 hours of processing. And those are the standards that have been applied for poultry processing. Now, what the Megareg did in 1996, it created 4 major areas of focus. One was standard operating procedures, testing for generic E. coli, Salmonella performance standards, and of course HACCP. And this changed the way in which we produced processed poultry in the U.S. So if you look at Salmonella, there was a reason why we needed to improve the standards, particularly for poultry. Here we're looking at cattle, steers, cows, ground beef, hogs, broilers, ground chicken, and ground turkey. And look at the percent positives. If you had ground turkey, over half of those products in the 90s were determined to be positive for Salmonella. Wherein, if you look at steers and heifers, it was only 1%. Hogs a little bit higher, but chickens clearly were the predominant issue that we were concerned about. So these are trends in Campylobacter starting back into the late 1990s. And that blue line indicates the actual data, and the red line indicates the target. So we've not gotten to the target in the U.S. for reducing the incidence of Campylobacter. And you can see that we really should be around 8%, but we're still hovering in that 12 to 13 or 14% range. So some issues still to be addressed with Campylobacter. Salmonella, quite frankly, looks pretty flatlined to me. It has not changed tremendously. And again, the standard is lower than what we're seeing. So there needs to be obviously some additional improvements to meet that target. And again, these are looking at Salmonella species infections per 100,000 in the population. So it's not changing that dramatically since the mid or the late 1990s. Listeria actually has had some significant improvements. We are at the target level, but remember, Listeria is a lot more problematic. Almost 1 out of 5 people with a Listeria infection end up dying. 0.5% for Salmonella. So there's a great deal of more motivation to get those Listeria incidence rates down to those targets. So if you look at the processing, where are the major points for contamination, and particularly cross-contamination? Most birds in the house that they're produced are negative. But when we move into the processing plant and in transport, we get much more cross-contamination, whether it's at scalding, picking, or evisceration. So if you look at log reductions of Campylobacter or from broilers, and you can look at different stages of the process, where do you find the most Campylobacter? Pre-scald, it actually drops after scald before picking of the feathers. Post-pick, it goes back up. Evisceration is about the same. And thankfully, as we move through the chilling process, those figures do drop. but it's still a challenge as we're moving into moving from cut up into packaging to make sure that we have those below those levels that we see. One of the things that's certainly going to be, I think, important is what's referred to as post-chill antimicrobial interventions, but it depends on where your market is. In certain parts of the EU, you cannot use, well, they will not allow the importation of poultry that has been processed with chlorinated water. So there's other alternative compounds that can be used that I think will be at least as effective, if not more so. But the good thing about post-chill interventions is that you're treating a much smaller volume of water. When you're in the chill tank, it is much, much larger. Primary chill tanks anywhere from 20 to 50,000 gallons. And if you're looking at the post-chill finishing chiller, only 400 to 500 gallons. So it's a much, much smaller volume, and we can change those fluid volumes out more frequently. This happens to be an example of one finishing chiller that happens to be produced by the Morris Company. There are others on the market. This is not an endorsement of that product, but that gives you an idea. It, again, holds around 400 to 500 pounds. So the things that are going to occur, I think, in our processing as we move forward is more stringent salmonella performance standards, implementation of performance standards for Campylobacter, and the hope is that we'll see fewer salmonella cases and fewer Campylobacter cases as a result of the new regulatory guidelines that have been produced in the U.S. So these are effective. Were effective in 2011. Again, the targets for salmonella 7.5, Campylobacter a little bit over 10% as well. This is from data from Dr. Shelley McKee for the U.S. Poultry and Egg Export Council. So some of the strategies that are being utilized, because many companies in the U.S. market are moving away from antibiotics. And so we're looking at things like probiotics, much more stringent biosecurity, vaccination programs, as well as feed and water safety. In the processing plants, again, adoption of good manufacturing procedures. Of course, HACCP, which has been with us now for over 20 years, and interventions, antimicrobials that are allowed in the U.S. but not in the EU, for example, chlorine. But there's also an opportunity to use peroxyacetic acid, which is an alternative, and other compounds as well. So some of the challenges that we have, there's a growing interest in organic poultry production in the U.S., but you're really limited on what we can provide as a means to control disease. So a lot of organic producers struggle with trying to figure out how can they be profitable and not have to use a lot of pharmaceuticals to treat their animals. And again, in the EU, there's limitations on what kind of products we can produce if we want to export to them. When certain European countries adopted a no antibiotic use for growth promotion, they actually subscribed more antibiotics the next couple of years until they figured out how they can produce those birds in a non-antibiotic environment. And that's something that U.S. producers are still learning. And there's some alternative production systems, again, free range, that create some challenges on egg production, cage-free, where animals are going to have access to fecal material to a higher degree, and also the potential for infection as well. So let me acknowledge my colleagues. Dr. Manpreet Singh is at the University of Georgia Department of Food Science, and he's an expert in pre- and post-harvest poultry. And Dr. Shelley McKee, who's the Director of Technical Services at the U.S. Poultry and Egg Council. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Professor Sam. And well, I think that the next talk will be given by Dr. Amrit Bhatt. So could everyone welcome him?
Hey, well, good afternoon. I know Sam woke you up. Now I don't have to fight that battle. Um, I again thank you for including us in this program. And I guess there needs to be a little bit of qualifier in at least my being a presenter. I am by no means a food safety expert, so I can't claim to be that in seafood or any food for that matter. But I know a little bit about seafood and fish production and processing, so I can maybe put some of my ideas or thoughts forward. So before I do that, I want to just take a few minutes and talk about our college, some of the things that we're doing in the college with respect to food safety issues. I was looking at the program. I don't think there's a place where we had a place to talk about that. There are a number of different international initiatives that we're taking with respect to food safety. There are a couple of programs. One of the things that we've been engaged in for the last 9 years is this we call a China Mini Summit, and which we hold annually. There are three Chinese, well, actually two Chinese and one Taiwanese institution involved in this, with University of Georgia, and recently we have additional two universities join, U.S. universities join this consortium, and annually we get together in a conference not unlike this, a rather small group of us, and we discuss a lot about food safety related matters, food safety and food trade, and in that we try to figure out what are the key issues, what are the key trends, and then we try to find collaborative partners. So University of Georgia faculty will come and make presentations, and Chinese and Taiwanese scientists will come together and make presentations, and then we find a way to collaborate, and then a number of different things come out of it. For example, manuscripts, student sharing, holding conferences or other meetings together. So and also sharing, having students visit different universities as a process. So this is one of the outcomes, or number of outcomes from that initiative. The other food safety related activity that we're engaged in is to work with various government partners. In this case, we've been working with Indonesian government to see if there are ways that we can help improve their institutions in food safety related matters. So we've had a number of delegations come to UGA, look at our facilities, and we have made visits to their facilities and then have made inputs. And one of the things that they're concerned about is this the policies that are coming out of food safety concerns that are not really trusted and that are not followed. And here is the explanation that I think we've come to, or at least the conclusion that we've come to. There is a lot of I guess maybe lack of trust among different institutions. So there's the government entity, and there's a university or research entity, and then there's a private sector entity. And when it comes to generating policies and being adopted by industry, depends on the trust on the research, the data that's generated to support that industry. Sorry, that policy. So what happens is that when there's a mismatch, the industry doesn't accept the policy and implementation of those policies. So one of the aim of us working in Indonesia is to try to figure out if there was a center similar to what we have, Center for Food Safety, and that's kind of like a bit independent, not fully part of a university, not a part of a government, not a part of a private sector, but somewhat a mix of that. And then if you have a little bit more independent entity, and when it generates data information, it's not biased for or by the industry, and it's not just for the research sake or for the policy sake. It's more of a independent entity that people can trust. And so if such an institution was created, then they would have a more robust policy mechanisms. So one of the things that we're discussing with the Indonesian government is to create such an entity, and there's some assistance being provided by USDA. So that's another part of what we do in food safety in international arena. Anyway, these are some of the things that we're doing. I just wanted to place that before I went on to my presentation. So those are. So I'm going to go ahead and start to talk about the food safety issues in seafood production, processing, and export. Well, let me see how I can make this work. All right, so I'm gonna not gonna take very long to go through the presentation that I have. I wanted to just basically talk a little bit about increase in global seafood consumption, and I want to talk a little bit about the foodborne risk associated with seafood, particularly in seafood. The issues of toxins are really important, and the microbial issues as well. And some of the controls of seafood-related illnesses, policies and regulation, enforcement, education and training, and some of the critical lessons are kind of integrated into my talk as we proceed. So this is an interesting. Okay, so sorry, I wanted to see if I can use the pointer. Okay, it's very weak. Okay, so this is a figure showing the total U.S. food supply. Of the total food supply, about 20% of the food is imported. And of those imported foods, if you look at the fresh produce, about 35% of the fresh produce are imported. And when we look at the seafood, 70% of our seafood is imported. That's a very significant portion of import, and that amounts to very large market for U.S. For other countries, seafood producing countries to exploit. So that keep that in mind as we move forward. There has been similar to or like poultry, there has been an increase in global seafood consumption, and although this data is a little bit older, the trend persists or is not unlike what is here. So when you there we go. So when we look at the seafood production over time, there's a general trend. I'm not going to use the pointer anymore. So so if you look at the world consumption, there's been relatively increased per capita consumption. And when you look at the China as a separate entity, you will see a significant increase. And although the capture fisheries in China is declining, and that's really an important aspect of increasing this aquaculture production. And the global while global fish capture fish is steady, there is a because of aquaculture, there's increase. The same thing. It's very interesting. Without China, the production and consumption is fairly flat, indicating the importance of China in seafood production and export. Let's see. So why is there this growth, and the growth is a result of a number of positive perceptions associated with the healthful effects of eating fish, and I think there was a number of presentations that have been made already talking about some of that in some of the other meats and poultry. So one of the positive effects of at least perception is that fish is of high quality, contains minerals and low fat. And this is particularly important, the minerals is particularly important in many of the developing countries or emerging countries, because fish is eaten as a whole rather than as a fillet or as a part. And when eaten as a whole, it contains a lot more minerals. And then so mineral content, and often it's considered the brain food. So if it's given to, particularly if the children are recipients of this, their brain development or cognitive development is more enhanced. So it's considered an important having fish in a diet is important part of normal brain development has been suggested. Of course, lower in fat. The other positive healthful effect is decreased risk of heart attack, stroke, or obesity, and also hypertension. And then, of course, the fatty acids, both the EPA and DHA, are considered to be at a higher level, which has been attributed to better heart health. Again, the fish has one of the highest feed conversion ratio, so it converts feed very efficiently. So it's an important and sustainable product. Again, in many of the countries, fish come from the source, aquaculture, or produced in so having low price because they're either caught or are produced in ponds or in captive environments. Both way, you get a reasonably lower price than many of the other types of meats, and perhaps not, well, in Thailand actually lower than chicken, I would say, many of the species, but in other countries maybe equivalent to that of poultry. And also they are available year-round because of the aquaculture practices. So when you compare the food consumption, you'll see the calories, protein, and fat. Fish wins out in most of the cases. This is some of the data coming from marine species. In terms of the calories, while they tend to have a higher calorie and high protein, fats tend to be relatively low, except for the ocean perch, and those are supposedly a better quality of fat and such. So we're concerned about the food safety. Food safety, we can be very, very safe and produce things that are in aquatic animals. We can talk about this in two ways. One is protein. Another is the oils. So if you're concerned about really a safety, one could be as sterile as this, the the oil pills, or the other end of it might be a shellfish. That's much less easy to regulate. So they are in both extreme in terms of the safety. So it depends on what level of tolerance that you have. Some of the contaminants of food of seafood are chemical contaminants, and then these are one of the more important issues in seafood. These are not in terms of the importance, but these are the range of different contaminants that we worry about when producing seafood. Lead, cadmium, mercury, dioxins and PCBs, and PHAs, and brominated flame retardants, melamine and structural analogs, marine-borne biotoxins are important part of seafood contaminants, and others as well. So these are some of the common seafood contaminants that we're concerned about. And the foodborne pathogens are associated with fish and fish products. Again, they're all ranged. You've probably seen it all day long today. Different types of pathogens. And again, in seafood, they're all present. They're all there. The ones that we mostly worry about are E. coli, Salmonella, Listeria, Campylobacter. These are very common pathogens that we worry about in seafood. And then more concerning is this bioaccumulation. As obviously, there is at each level, from contamination to incorporation into algae or additives, and then fish consuming, and you have the secondary and tertiary consumption. So at each level, there's bioaccumulation. So when you start eating carnivore species of fish like groupers and sea basses and those, then you begin to accumulate some of those. So being aware of these contaminants are part of safety concerns. I think you've seen this slide before. Again, aquatic animals, when you look at the foodborne illnesses, you will see bacterial, chemical, parasitic, and viral. Of that, chemical contaminants are one of the bigger concerns that seafood producers and processors have. Often the results are either hospitalizations or death. So this is very these are the things that the seafood people are concerned about. And obviously, if we want the policies to work, they need to be based on facts and science. Formulation sound policy requires research and testing and evaluation. And you need, obviously, the reputable and trusted institutions to add to this science. So this is kind of tying into what I was saying earlier. And again, the enforcement part, enforcement needs to be seemingly fair, clear, and they have to be wanted. And they have to, again, enforcers have to be credible for it to be accepted and followed. Number of speakers previously discussed how education and training is so critical to promoting safe food consumption and use. And when we look at that, you have the consumers that we have to be concerned about. So as we think about educating consumers, we need to be concerned about what do consumers need to do to keep seafood safe. What are the right way to handle and store seafood? Handling and storage is maybe different between fishes and shellfish. Again, keeping seafood safe. How do we do that? Freezing, preparation, cooking, marinating, serving. These are all parts of the concerns for the consumers, and for producers. Again, education and better management practices, HACCPs, and other critical point measures are important in the production part. And for market and retailers, often the concern is traceability and market and food fraud. I wanted to spend just a few minutes talking about the food fraud. Currently, there's a lot of discussion around this concept that food are being produced, processed, and sold, and often what we're eating is not what they say it is. So it's something else other than that product, and it's often easier to do with fish than some of the other products, because of fish, particularly when they begin to process fish, all the way from fillet to making little fish balls that we put in our soups. So there's people say, well, it comes from this fish. There's really very little test to really measure where it really comes from. So often that has become an issue for seafood industry, and there has been some concern over how do we deal with this food fraud concerns. So NSF International has developed a kind of comprehensive 7-step program to try to address this in a better way. I think you probably have this in your presentation better, but this kind of outlines some of the steps by which the food awareness and fraud awareness, detection, and preventions are mitigated or addressed. Again, I guess the final point I wanted to make is that seafood, like many other products, are not produced and consumed in the same country. They are products that cross national and international boundaries, and you know, there are some unlikely countries that are selling fish products to other countries. And here's an interesting example, because earlier I just showed you 70% of the fish is imported in the U.S. Yet here's the United States selling or exporting seafood to Thailand. So if we're just looking at the Thai market, you will see a number of different exporters exporting products to Thailand, and Thailand needs to be as conscious of this safety concern as any other country, because they're so internationally traded. Okay. Again, this is similar to what Sam was showing earlier, Dr. Purdue was showing earlier. We have a number of different agencies that are concerned with foodborne pathogens or food safety modernization or food safety inspection services, and these are regulatory and research and control institutions, and they work somewhat in harmony to produce safe and provide safe foods, and that's something that we ought to be looking at globally, not just in one country as in the U.S. So that's kind of what I wanted to present today. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Professor Amrit Bhatt. And well, the next talk will be given by Professor John Bernard. So I would like everyone to welcome him.
Good afternoon. I want to thank the committee for allowing me to come and speak with you today. I'm going to approach it a little bit different. My background, I grew up on a small farm, so we had a small dairy, so I produced milk, and then later on I hauled milk while I was going to school to make some money there, and then later on I actually worked for a dairy cooperative addressing quality issues and working with producers. So I'm going to approach this a little bit more from the farm standpoint, as far as some ideas on what we need to do to minimize the risk of food safety issues that can arise here, certainly in milk. You know, years ago we used to have a slogan that milk was nature's most perfect food because of the nutrients that it provided. Along with that, though, because of those nutrients, it is a good media for a number of diseases that can make us sick as well. Some of these come from the cows themselves, zoonotic diseases that can be transferred from the cow either through direct contact or through consumption of milk in this case. So we have to look at those and keep those in mind. Again, as I mentioned a moment ago, because of the nutritional properties of milk, it's a great media for growing different microorganisms. So we have to handle it properly to minimize those risks and development of microbes that could make us sick when it gets into the food chain. When we think about zoonotic diseases, these are a list of some of the ones that we incur on a, or at least used to incur on a regular basis. In the United States, we think most of these are gone, but an interesting development here just in the last 2 weeks, there was a lady in Texas that was diagnosed with brucellosis after she consumed milk that she bought, and it was unpasteurized milk. Some of these are still prevalent out there, and we have to be aware of them. They may not come through the food supply, but in some cases, in working with the animals, the producer or their workers can get that disease. So that is an issue as well that we have to keep in mind. I'm not a microbiologist, but there's a whole list of microbes that can live in can be found in milk. Fortunately, most of these are killed when we pasteurize the milk, but they can also become contaminants post-pasteurization in processing in plants, or again, more commonly, if we consume raw milk or products made from raw milk. If we look at the illnesses that are associated with milk and dairy products that affect people, the major ones have changed over the years. From things that we would think are more zoonotic in nature, tuberculosis, brucellosis, Q fever, some of those type of things, today to diseases caused more from some of the bacteria that may have contaminated the product. I think most of this is due to better management of the livestock, particularly some of our health programs, better education of our producers in the production methods that they use, as well as how we handle and market milk. One of the things that's been interesting to observe, and a comment's been made earlier about it, a lot of people today didn't grow up on the farm. They didn't come through the earlier time periods where there was a higher incidence of foodborne illness in the United States. As such, in the case of dairy products, the idea that raw milk is better for me than pasteurized milk, or products made from raw milk may be better. So what we're beginning to see is actually a little bit of an increase in some of the diseases that come from consumption of unpasteurized milk or dairy products made from those. So we have to be very conscious about that. And some data I found, and some of this is a little hard to come by, certainly not a lot of illnesses, 760 illnesses per year, 22 hospitalizations that were associated with consumption of milk and dairy products. The thing that was interesting is that 95% of those are due mainly to salmonella or campylobacter origin. But this is the thing that caught my attention. The consumers who used raw milk or products made from the raw milk were 838 times more likely to have an illness, or 45 times more likely to be hospitalized than consumers who consumed pasteurized products. So there is a big risk that the consumer takes there, even though the dairy is trying to do the good job. The difference in between when I was growing up and consuming raw milk and the consumer buying it today is it changes hands many more times. We had one special cow we would keep our milk from, and we would drink that milk. Today, that milk is milked, collected, distributed one or two different times before it gets to that consumer. There's a lot of opportunities there for mistakes. Now, I think from the standpoint of how do we minimize these, we need to start back and look at training. And certainly, I'm sure most of you recognize this, you have a great history of training producers here on how to milk cows, how to take care of cows, and how to do it properly. That's not a one-time deal. We have to continually provide education because, like many of us, we learn how to do something, we get into doing something, and we kind of change the methods and forget why, and then something goes wrong, and we have to go back and remember, yeah, I need to do it this way, and there's a good reason why. I think there's several opportunities here for control points that we look at, and again, a lot of this will involve opportunities to educate producers and their workers. There is some checks and balances that come into play. It starts with disease control. Again, we talked about zoonotic diseases as one of the issues here. So having a good preventative health program there and then a surveillance program to follow up for checks and balances. Good hygiene is just as important out on the farm as it is in the production plant. And we're going to expand that to include the housing for our cows. We want our cows to be clean. Here, we want the animals, when they come in, to be milked, be clean. We want good harvesting and storage equipment here. And then quality control programs. When we have an animal that gets sick, we need to treat it. How do we handle those residues there that are going to be secreted in the milk? How do we deal with issues such as alpha toxin that come through contamination of feedstuffs that maybe we get and the cow consumes? There may be other potential contaminants. We've talked about issues where pesticides or other residues can come through. So having some checks and balances there and looking at those things. From a preventative health program, that starts with working with a local vet that knows the diseases that are going to be prevalent within a given area. They're going to know the vaccines that are going to work. They know how to manage those and how to work with the producer to make sure that they are giving properly and handled properly. So, you know, there's differences among vaccines killed live. There's times when they're appropriate to administer and we get a better immune response and protection. There's times when that doesn't work. There is proper protocols for how we store and handle those vaccines and different products there and how we administer them. All those come into play, and then compliance. And that's where someone that understands those methods works with that producer to help them develop a program specific to their farm and teach their people how to do that. But we also have to follow up with surveillance. Still in the United States, we have said we've eradicated brucellosis. There's still some brucellosis around. We used to vaccinate all the young animals, and then we'd still test all the animals going through to slaughter. Milk is still tested and screened on a regular basis. We have to look at those type of things there to make sure that we don't have an outbreak of some kind of a zoonotic disease, whether it's something like brucellosis or tuberculosis or whatever else. And if we can implement those things, we can stay out in front of it before it becomes a problem. Biosecurity. I've had an opportunity to ride around and see some of your farms and some of your processing plants. You have a number of biosecurity measures implemented. We all have to work on those to make them better. And part of that, again, comes back with the opportunity to educate producers here on why we have to do these things and what steps we need to implement on the farm there to minimize the risk of introducing diseases. There's a lot of things here from the standpoint of proper worker protection, providing gloves, if you would, there, safety glasses maybe in some cases, or as mentioned earlier today, just a sink or a facility and some soap there so they can clean their hands and make sure they're not going to spread that disease if they've been working with the sick animal to go on to another animal, let alone infect themselves. Control of traffic in and out of the farms to minimize introduction or spread of disease, isolation of animals as you move them into the herd, and sanitation of that equipment that we use to work on animals there before we go to the next animal or before the next event there. One of the things I think a lot of times we forget, and we forget this sometimes in the United States as well, is that we can develop the best program, vaccination program, know how to do it, but if our animals are stressed, they aren't going to respond properly. And when we think about stress, there's a number of places that comes into play, how we handle that animal. You know, in the United States, we talk about some of the cowboys, and we have some cowboys that are not necessarily gentle on animals, but we have others who know how to work gently with animals, and they always get a better response there. Environmental stress, we have that. You certainly have that here. If we can minimize some of the heat stress or change our times when we administer those vaccines, we can get a better immune response there. Cow comfort. We see that if we can make that cow comfortable and keep her clean, she's not only going to be healthier, she's also going to produce more. So we have to keep those things in mind as we think about that overall program. And if we do those things, then we can optimize immune function. And one of the things there, too, is just making sure we feed a good balanced diet so the cow has the opportunity to respond. Once we do that, then there are some opportunities for some additives that can be put into the ration, whether it's extra trace minerals or whether it's some immune modulators that have been shown to provide a little extra response and immunity to the cow. But we have to have that diet balance first to make sure that's working before we add these in. Those are not a substitute for good management. If we look at dairy cattle, compared to beef cattle, they typically get more shots, whether it's vaccinations. We use a lot of estrus synchronization programs in the United States. And all those set up opportunities here for problems, either from a quality standpoint on meat or from a food safety standpoint if we have a needle that happens to break off when we give an injection. So knowing how to give those injections, where to give those injections, maybe is going to do more for quality. If we have a broken needle, certainly that becomes a safety issue there for whoever is going to consume that cut of meat. And it does happen from time to time. Now, when we get into day-to-day practices, one of the things that we can do is just a basic hygiene there on having that animal good and clean to harvest that milk. When we harvest milk, we're harvesting a food product. And the cleaner the cow is and the cleaner the equipment is, that's going to keep our product safe to start out with. If it's dirty, even though the milk coming out of the cow is clean and pure, we contaminate it very early in the process, and it's only going to get worse as it goes through the production cycle. So we got to remember that all these bacteria we listed earlier that make us sick are out in the environment every day. They're going to be on the skin of the cow, on her teeth. So we need to make sure we keep those cows clean. The cleaner we can keep them, the lower that pathogen load is going to be that we expose that milk to. Then, as we do that, we can improve milk quality as well as reduce some of our safety issues. Now, this happens to be a score sheet that I found here that's just a good visual tool that you can use with producers. And you can take and make these on your own, from very clean to some cows that are somewhat dirty there on the side. And you can probably take examples that look even worse than this. We want our facilities to be nice and clean. If we're starting on the bottom side, we're not going to have good food safety consistently. And we're going to have very poor quality. And consumers, if they have product that goes bad early or they get sick on it, they're not going to be your future consumers because they don't want to get poor quality again or waste that money on something they think is going to be bad. So one of the things that when we're handling milk and harvesting there, again, it's a food plant. So we need to have proper sanitation here for our milking equipment. And there's a number of things that we go into, and if you go out to the dairies to visit, you know, they're going to have the detergents, they're going to have the acid rinse, they're going to have the sanitizers there. But probably the thing that I found when I was working in the field troubleshooting was the presence of hot water or adequate hot water so those soaps, detergents could work as they were designed. If that's not there, we're not going to have a good cleaning sitting. And maintaining that equipment, whether it's cleaning those inflations, changing the hoses there, maintaining those pulsators are all important more so for quality, but also in maintaining a good, healthy food system. There's a lot of ways that we can milk a cow or prep that cow to get her ready to be milked and let her milk down. Our objective is to make sure the cow lets her milk down, and then 2, to harvest good, clean milk. The thing that's probably most important about this up here is being consistent from day to day in whatever protocol you put together out on the farms. I see a lot of differences out in our dairies in the United States, but they try to make them consistent. And we check the quality there to make sure that it is there on a regular basis. Milk storage. This is an issue that comes up and varies a lot as you travel around the world. In the United States, we have to harvest that milk, have it below 40 degrees within 2 hours. Okay? Here, you don't have a lot of cooling on the farm. You're delivering the warm milk straight to the plant. And bacteria grow very quickly in a warm environment. So, taking some steps here to cool that milk. When I was growing up, we didn't have the bulk cooler like this. We had cold water we put the cans in to try to chill it down. Maybe not as good as the cooler, but it was a first step there. So, devising that program here that is something that your local producers can implement and adopt without being an economic hardship is another good step. More so for food quality standpoint or milk quality, more so maybe than safety, but it certainly plays in with the safety part of it. Now this is a slide I probably should have broke out and covered in several different areas. There's a lot of things that go into quality control. When I was hauling milk, they'd take the sample, they'd go test that in the lab before we would unload. And they checked it for a number of things, including antibiotics, including sediment. They'd look at a bacteria count under the microscope, but they'd also look for water. Sometimes if cows aren't milking good, the farmer gets a little industrious, they may take the water hose and add a little bit to the milk. Not what they should do, but it is a source of contamination. If that water is contaminated and you put that in the milk, or if you use that contaminated water to rinse out some of the equipment, you've contaminated your product there. And that is an issue there that we have to certainly be aware of. So that is something to look at. In our country, our water samples or our water supply has to be tested at least once each year. And it has to be free of E. coli or any other organisms. If we find it there, we have the opportunity to treat the well. If we can't treat it successfully, then we have to put a chlorination system in there to make sure that we have good, clean, pure water. The other 2 issues, I think, are some things that need to talk about, and certainly takes a lot of education. Preventing residues and antibiotics, in particular, from getting into the milk supply or food supply is a big issue. A lot of people have allergies to certain antibiotics. So if those residues come into the food supply through milk in this case, it is a contaminant. It is going to cause an adverse reaction in some people. The other part about it is if you're trying to make cheese or some other products there that are cultured, those antibiotics don't help your process very much. So educating producers about proper use of antibiotics, proper withdrawal times is very important. And then having a system there to monitor for residues. Most of our producers are much larger than what you have here. We have on-farm tests for looking for residues. In our operation, we test every cow after they calve before they go back into the milk tank. If we have to treat a cow, that cow is tested for residues before her milk is actually put back into the tank. We've taken a lot of safeguards there to prevent contamination. Most of the products we've been testing for are penicillin or penicillin derivatives. We're getting ready to start testing for other types of antibiotic residues as well. So it's going to be important to educate producers there on, one, the products that they are allowed to use, what are the withdrawal times, and then how do we manage that to prevent from contaminating milk. In our system, if that milk truck comes up to be positive for an antibiotic, it has to be dumped, discarded. That producer that caused the contamination has to pay for all that milk. So it can be an economic hardship, much more so than throwing away milk from one cow. So that is an opportunity here to educate those producers and work with them, particularly as we get new drugs out there or we start to see some of those contaminations. The other area is alpha toxin or mycotoxins in general. We see some problems sporadically in the United States. Here you have an environment that is more conducive to growing mycotoxins year-round. And they occur when the cow consumes feed that is contaminated with those mycotoxins. Alpha toxin is the one most everybody looks for because it is a carcinogen, and we do not want that in our food supply. Okay. Other mycotoxins are more of a problem for production and health of the individual cow. We don't want those either, but they aren't transferred into the milk as readily. But the alpha toxin is transferred very readily. When the cow consumes it, it's absorbed into the bloodstream and then out of the bloodstream into the milk. And it's very efficient and very quick how it happens. So how you manage that is a problem or a challenge here that you have to deal with. We screen a lot of our ingredients to try to identify this lot of feed is contaminated. We're not going to feed it to dairy cattle. It may be safe to feed to something else because it's not going to be transferred into the milk and we have enough time to get it out of the system. Once we find it into the milk, we have some products that we can use. There's a number of things, and some producers use these day in, day out to try to mitigate the instance of alpha toxin showing up in the milk. There's some of our clays. Bentonite, for instance, is used quite commonly. It's one of the cheaper alternatives. There's aluminum silicates that are available commercially. There are some yeast cell wall products that seem to work. The affinity for each of those products is a little bit different for each mycotoxin. Some of these work extremely well for alpha toxin, but they may not work well for DON or some of the other mycotoxins. So it's identifying what mycotoxins that you have in the feedstuffs and choosing the appropriate product then that will bind those and keep them from being absorbed, as well as trying to minimize the amount in that total diet there. That's the first step we want to take. So those are some challenges there that we get into. There's other things that come up from time to time as contaminants. It's working with reputable feed suppliers that test their feeds that do not have residues from pesticides, herbicides that aren't allowed. It's making sure we don't get cross-contamination from antibiotics or something else. For instance, in our situation, we may have a feed mill that makes a medicated feed that goes for hogs. If that plant is making a dairy feed, they need to work something in between as a good management practice to minimize the risk for any antibiotics residues that might have been left somewhere in the mixer or in the feed handling equipment, so it doesn't get into the feed there that we feed to the animal. So those are issues there we deal with. We have an inspection system there to provide some checks and balances here that consist of on-farm inspection as well as checking samples of milk as well as identifying animals there at the livestock market. Most of these are run by our state Department of Agriculture, but many of our dairy cooperatives today have programs in place to monitor for quality and food safety issues. Again, they want to make sure we have a high quality product that is processed in and goes out into the industry so we don't have problems with consumer perception there. Summary, again, dairy farms and milk in particular can be a source of pathogens that can make us sick. So we have to take steps there to minimize those. A lot of that involves working with our producers to educate them on what those risks are, how do we minimize them, How do we keep ourselves and our workers safe there? What do we need to do here in terms of quality control measures here, whether it's disease surveillance or testing of raw milk and processed products there to keep any problems out of the food chain? And then one of the things that we found effective, or at least producers have responded to, the markets, and mainly this is driven by the processor, but also a lot of our dairy cooperatives, we have limits that are state mandated, federal mandated, but most of those cooperatives today have lower levels, particularly on our quality measures. And what they have done, they've instituted premiums for producers to meet those higher standards. And they get a lot higher compliance by doing that as opposed to just the higher state mandates. Higher state mandates, I can have a bad sample, I can still sell my milk, I can go on. If it gets too high in this system, there's actually a penalty on the price you get paid, but then there's a premium, the opportunity, if you want to do a good job, to make a more profit off the same volume of milk just for doing a good job. And our producers have responded very nicely to that. So with that, I'll finish, and I know we'll have some questions here later. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Professor John and all speakers. So I think now we have roughly 30 minutes for the question. So now the floor is open for any question and comments. Please.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. I am Ms. Farah Jabbar. I'm PhD student in Faculty of Technology, Department of Biotechnology. First of all, I would like to appreciate my pleasure to get this great attitude in your respectable symposium, and thank you very much for interesting lectures. Actually, my question is Prof. Dr. Sam, if he don't mind. Doctor, I would like to ask you about one of your slides, which is related to causes of foodborne illnesses between 1998 and 2008. You said that a plant is the most causes of foodborne if we compare it to land animals and aquatic animals. Actually, I'm a little bit confused about that because we know that the plant maybe is the more safe than the other. If we're talking about maybe chemicals, it will be maybe yes because of pesticides and herbicides that we treated animal. But related to parasites and bacteria, I think it should be with land and aquatic animals. So could you please explain to me that?
Sure. One of the things that if you look in the U.S., for example, the more recent outbreaks that we've seen with Salmonella, for example, and E. coli actually occurred in things like bean sprouts and cantaloupes and peppers and tomatoes. They may have an animal origin from where those organisms actually came from. In certain systems, for example, in organic systems where they're using animal manure as a fertilizer source, that is one of the ways in which we're seeing bacterial-borne illnesses from plant-based products. So yeah. So hopefully the math works out there. There may be some rounding errors, but the land animals still have, the majority of the bacterial infections, 64%, and plants about half of that. So it's less. If you look at the total contaminants.
Related to aquatic animals, sorry. If you compare between plants and aquatic animals, it will be 32 compared to 3.9.
Yeah, I can only tell you what the CDC says, and that's the data that they had, that bacterial infections associated with aquatic animals was quite low.
Quite low than
Yeah.
plants?
Yeah. Lower than plants. Yep.
Thank you very much.
I'll yield to my colleague who is far more knowledgeable, and if he's got any insights on that, Dr. Francisco Gonzalez Diaz.
The data is correct, and I guess this is in many what I can remember from this table most likely was based on outbreaks, and definitely the outbreaks related to seafood are not that common, and that's reflects in this data that I think in terms of total cases we don't really know whether we could corroborate this data or not. But mostly, in my opinion, based on the outbreak data more than anything.
Thank you.
Any questions so far? Well, actually, I have got some questions from the audience when I went out for the break. So this question probably go to Dr. Amrit first, and then we go to you and you. Well, since you have been living in Asia quite a long time, so can you tell us about fish consumption and fish safety compared to the other meats in Asia country, and of course compared to the US?
Yeah. The fish. So the question of consumption. Fish consumption in the U.S. is relatively low. I can't remember exactly what the recent numbers are, but it's significantly lower than the fish consumption in Asia in particular. And so the issue of consumption, and also the variety. In Asia, there's a lot more choices, both marine and freshwater, as well as brackish water. So there is a variety of species that are consumed, and then along with that, it's the way of preparations are variable depending on the species. And in the U.S., the requirements are quite stringent. So generally, the fish-related illnesses or deaths obviously are going to be much more tame than it's going to be out here. And then obviously, as I walk through the streets of Bangkok or Manila or somewhere else, it's the safety regulations are much more lax. And also, the foods are coming, particularly fish, they're coming from small producers. There is the kinds of regulated industry or regulated product as we have in the U.S. So we can do more or less much better tracing of products that come in than you would be here. So not that I'm saying it's any less or more safer. I just think that there's much more variability here than it is in our part of the world.
I think the same question goes to Professor Sam for the poultry consumption, and also later on go to Dr. John for the dairy products.
I'm sorry, my jet lag is a little bit wearing on me. If you'd repeat that question for related to poultry. Yeah, well, if you look, some of it is based upon regional differences. For example, in avian influenza, that has created some differences between that here in Asia and in North America. We're seeing a couple incidences where we've had outbreaks of avian influenza in the U.S. isolated cases, but have historically been more prominent in Asia. So that may play a role there. My sense is there's far more live markets available in Asia than say in the U.S., which has the potential to contribute to differences in the incidence rates, and the different products that are produced. There's certainly some products like blood sausage that may be more likely consumed in certain cultures than in the U.S. that might contribute to those things as well. So some of it's production practices and transportation and refrigeration storage issues as well.
Relative to dairy, our per capita consumption is much higher than what it would be here, but then our production is also much higher. If you look at the trends in the United States, there's a trend for a little lower fluid milk consumption, but an increase in cheese, some of our yogurts, some of the other products that come into play. The instance of diseases related to dairy products, for the most part, is relatively low. Most of the problems we see, particularly within the last 5 years, that are significant in terms of hospitalizations, in terms of some deaths, have been related to consumption of raw milk or some product made from raw milk. And that seems to be growing a little bit. It's not huge, but it is a concerning issue. We have a lot more people that want to go pick up a cow and maintain, but then they sell some of that milk to neighbor or somebody else down the road, and that's where we start to see most of our problems here. All of our milk that is consumed, or at least the products and such, has to be pasteurized. So that is a huge step in terms of quality control. I'm not familiar with the instance of diseases here related to dairy consumption or product consumption. But I would suspect that if there are issues, most of those are probably related to consumption of raw milk or product made from raw milk.
Thank you so much. I have another question from the audience. They ask, what is the minimum or the maximum that we should concern before exporting dairy product, poultry product, or seafood to other neighboring countries? Minimum and maximum. This is what maybe step consider. Yes. This is the question to ask.
Typically, our regulatory groups keep a very detailed analysis on issues that relate to food safety, and they report every instance to CDC that comes through that is diagnosed, and that information is publicly available. So that information is available there to all our trading partners. One of the things that has changed the dairy industry in the United States over the last 5 years is there's been a move within the states to lower our somatic cell count from 750,000 cells per milliliter down to something lower. The position that the state health departments, the state Department of Agriculture has taken is it's not a safety issue. At that level, milk does not present any kind of a safety issue. It does represent a quality issue and a manufacturing issue or opportunity. As such, the European Union set a rule of 400,000 cells per milliliter. Any milk or product that goes into the European Union has to meet that. So by default, we have to meet that 400,000 minimum number there, and that information for dairy producers is recorded each month. Each tanker load of milk is tested. It's averaged for the month. They keep a 3-month rolling average there, and most cooperatives are maintaining a database that would have several years of data off of each producer.
I'm not sure I understand the question. Well, this is the question here. What is the minimum or the maximum that we should consider for making something safe products to the other label? I guess like minimum or maximum state that we should go through for exporting our product to the other.
So I guess the question is a little bit vague, but maybe it's asking for Asian countries, what should be what are the steps before they are exportable? So what are the steps one might go before they're exportable? That's a tough question. It depends what the purpose is of exporting. I think there are regulatory requirements for exporting, but it should meet whatever the national standards are, and what the requirements of accepting institutions are. Of course, if you're exporting to Europe, I know they set their standards, and we have to meet those standards. In that case, sometimes they use this as a trade barrier, and we've seen that happen multiple cases. I know at least in shrimp export, they often set a certain amount of antibiotics to be at a background level, which would then completely stop from making it across the border. But basically, I know FDA does regular training of Asian countries when they about what are the steps necessary, or what you need to do in order to be able to export to the U.S. market. So there are certain kinds of requirements, and people come from FDA to do actual training to producers, processors, and retailers about marketing. Within Asia, however, I'm not sure what the requirements are for Thailand to sell to Vietnam, for example. Maybe you have a question. I thought you had answered for that.
Real quickly on the poultry side, on the U.S. poultry markets for imports into the U.S., there are only 2 countries that are currently certified to import fresh poultry products. That's Canada and Chile. Now, there recently was a regulation provided that would allow China to import cooked product into the U.S., but here's the catch-22. The chicken has to be processed in a plant that's approved, that's either in Canada, Chile, or the United States. So currently, there's no way that China is going to take fresh product that's produced in those 3 countries, bring it back to China, cook it, and then export it back to the U.S. So while there may be technically an opportunity there, it has not been the case. And there's 2 factors that determine importation. One would be the Food Safety Inspection Service to look at processing, and then APHIS that looks at what's the disease background in a particular country. Are there diseases there that are endemic in poultry flocks that we would not want introduced into the U.S.? So there's really 2 levels that a country, if they want to export poultry to the U.S., would have to meet, and that's both the sanitation regs on processing and also what are the endemic diseases. I will tell you that there are some non-tariff trade barriers that come up. One time, for example, we had the Soviet Union refused to accept U.S. poultry imported into their country for a short period of time because they said the sanitation levels in the U.S. processing plants did not meet their standards. And I have colleagues who've been in Russian processing plants, and I can assure you the ones in the U.S. are significantly better, in my opinion. But it was a way to to limit U.S. imports. And, I understand they want to protect their domestic market. So it can be used as a way to limit trade.
And from a dairy standpoint, I believe Thailand is a milk deficient country. I would suspect that the opportunities are greater to sell fresh milk in country rather than even exploring any export opportunities until production picks up to a point that you start to meet internal needs. In the United States, currently about 13 to 15% of our total milk goes into export. Most of that is in either cheese, butter, or powder form there. There's very little to no fluid milk that gets exported unless it's very close into Mexico or Canada, or there may be a little bit going into the Puerto Rico at the moment, but that's an exception rather than the normal, just because of the cost.
But I think that we have a question from Daria, right? So, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maria Teresa S. Medialdia. I work here in Mekong Institute. And, of course, thank you to the speakers for very interesting presentations, including the speakers in the morning. But my question actually has nothing to do with the presentation. I just would like to take advantage of the expertise that we have today from the U.S. And my question is, very recently, there is now the strong desire or interest to promote food safety in the region. And if we look at the U.S., of course, you are very much more advanced in terms of promoting food safety. You even have now the Food Safety Modernization Act. Now, if I come from small countries, for example, like Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam, and we have very limited resources. Given those limited resources and the lack of capabilities among the different stakeholders promoting food safety, and there's a lot of problems with infrastructure, like absence of, for example, lab testing facilities or unreliable surveillance systems, and then you also have a lot of problems with policies on food safety. Some of them are not updated, and it needs review for coherence and relevance. So these many challenges, if I would ask your advice, what are the simple things or initiatives or activities that we can, from a small country like mine, that we can do to create the greatest impact at a very short period of time? That's my question. And that question is for all the speakers since this morning. Thank you.
So one thing I would mention to you is that in the U.S. there is a growing interest in local food, and that I think has the potential to impact food safety, because in some parts of the developing world, logistics it can be a challenge, moving product from one area where it's produced to another where it's consumed. So my recommendation would be to start and look at local food hubs where the food is produced and consumed in a relatively small geographic area. Now, I realize that there's certain economies of scale where you can be a more efficient producer if you're really, really large, but that necessitates then the ability to be able to transport that product to a larger geographic area. So if you want to have the term we use in the U.S. is low-hanging fruit, something that's easy to get to, I would focus on local food hubs where you're producing the food in a relatively small region and consumed in that same region. So we've got shorter transportation times, you've got less dependency on refrigerated transport and things of that nature. And I will say, I think one of the reasons why perhaps we have a more stringent food safety system is that we have a lot more lawyers in the U.S. who look for ways to sue if somebody is injured. I think the United States has one of the highest percentages of attorneys per capita than any place on the planet. So perhaps we do things out of noble reasons because we want to provide safe food. That's one thing. But also I think there's a trend towards litigation that we would like to avoid.
And I would add too, dairy is a little bit unique in that a lot of the milk is marketed to cooperatives or directly to plants. They have some marketing or some monitoring programs already in place to check the quality of milk. You can identify groups there in that to go out and educate and try to help improve in terms of quality and minimize food safety, and working with those. At the same time, work with those producers to help them improve their production to provide a better supply of milk long term. And that would be some low-hanging fruit before you get into all the other things there and start moving product around. But dairy is a little bit unique than some of the others, so you've already got some of that infrastructure in place.
I guess the low-hanging fruit, as you think about, I guess I see it in two levels. One is at the more country level, and another is more in a regional level. In a country level, I think one of the biggest things that we probably need to concentrate on is the education and training and awareness raising of the consumers. I think that will drive the other parts. But if consumers are wanting higher quality foods and safer foods, then I think market should respond or would respond. So that would be looking at education, training, and awareness raising. And in the side of producers, I would concur with my colleague here that creating cooperatives, creating nucleuses of producers, and then promoting a best or better management practices. I think rather than stringent regulations, I think that probably is easier to implement awareness and better management practices. And in the market level, I think is another intervention that we can probably do as far as the seafood and others are concerned. And again, there we can do better in terms of making them aware, making the market aware of what the best practices are, both in live market or wet markets, and for them to be aware of what hygienic conditions that they ought to be adopting. I think at the very local level, those things need to be taken care of. But in the regional level, I think there are lots of policies. Each country has its own set of policies and practices. Some of those could be harmonized, and which would in turn allow products to cross-border more easily and more conveniently. But I think that's not an easy solution. I think that's a little bit of a more difficult solution, and not a low-hanging fruit. But I think that's a necessary part in order to facilitate cross-border and cross-country export and import.
But I would make one more comment. There's also another conference going on about academic honesty, and one of the things that why do people cheat academically is that they believe that they won't get caught. And so there is an element that if you develop testing facilities, what happens over time is that consumers begin to associate a certain product or brand with higher quality, and therefore that will drive more consumers to that brand. If they don't believe that brand X is as safe as brand B, they're going to buy brand B more often, and actually may pay a premium for that product simply because there's confidence that they have in that. But there needs to be, and this is probably more on a national level, a way to do some testing. Now that it's not cheap. It can be costly, and it's something that requires, I think, a long-term investment to assure those folks. Most producers want to do a good job and do things the right way, but there's always that temptation. If I can make a little bit more money this way and cut some corners, if they don't think they're ever going to get tested, then there's not the same motivation.
I think a couple of thoughts in trying to answer your question, which is, I think one of them is looking at what I've learned in my interactions with CDC and the appreciation that I've developed over the power of having epidemiological data. I think investing in public health departments and probably try to get some partnership with other countries in terms of adopting some of the surveillance systems that have been successful. Because ultimately, I guess if you don't know where your problems are, it's hard to establish interventions. So you need to better characterize the set of hazards typically present and affecting the population, so you could better target your interventions. That's in a much more global picture. That's what I would suggest.
All right. On that note, I think there's a lot of more interesting discussions that we have, and we can continue it tomorrow because we're still continuing our sessions tomorrow morning. And at this point, let's put our hands together for our friends from University of Georgia for their wonderful insights. Dr. Sam, Dr. Emrit, and Dr. John. And of course, I would like to thank Kay Jan for moderating the session this afternoon. And yeah, thank you very much. And of course, lastly, I would like us to clap for ourselves because there's still a lot of us this afternoon. I think the last count that we did is like 70 or 80 of us are still here in the hall. So let's give ourselves a warm round of applause. And hopefully we still see each other, and if you can invite your friends, because tomorrow we'll have interesting discussion, panel discussion in the morning. So just a reminder, the registration will start at 8:30 in the morning. So hopefully you'll be here by that time. And also one last reminder, there's a campus tour tomorrow afternoon. And if you want to join the campus tour to be hosted by KKU, please inform the organizers outside. And I guess that's it for today. Thank you very much for your active participation, and hopefully see you tomorrow morning at 8:30. And now we proceed to the party. We have the Mekong Institute will be hosting a cocktail reception at the first floor. So if we could all go there and have some fun tonight. See you and have a good night.